Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming, here, as always, with a little more dressed up than usual, my friend, colleague, and co-host, Mr. Tim O'Toole. What's up, Tim?
How's it going, Brian? I have a work appointment right after we record, so I actually had to look respectable.
Tim has a meeting with the government in about an hour, so as a result, we're going to try to do this very efficiently today, and that actually is good because that was our plan all along, to do an all lightning round episode today to catch up on a few things that we missed while we were out on summer vacation, and to hit on a couple of other new items that have just popped up in the last week or so. So welcome to everybody. Welcome back to Embargoed. Thank you all for listening. Thanks to everybody who listened to the episode that we did a few weeks ago with Michael. Appreciate all the good feedback and comments we got on that. And we are back to, as I said, more the normal format, although we are going to go all lightning round style today. So before I get to the quick rundown of the topics, the normal reminders that we are not sharing any confidential information, we're not giving legal advice. Any and all opinions that you hear today are those of me and Tim. So if you disagree with them, they are our fault and our fault alone. If you do like the pod, please subscribe. Please leave us a rating, hopefully a 5-star rating, and spread the word. We are back now that we're just about fully into fall here officially. And so with that, let me give a quick rundown of what we're going to cover today, and then we'll jump right in. So again, on the old lightning round episode, we are going to cover Iran, JCPOA 2.0, Afghanistan, Russia, Belarus, China through the lens of CFIUS, which we haven't talked about in a little while, a recent OFAC enforcement action that is back to Iran again for a few minutes, and then closing with something really truly brand new, which is Ethiopia and the new executive order and the new program that were just stood up on Friday. We're recording this on Monday, September 20. So with that, Tim, any comments before we dive right in?
It's a small world, Brian. Lots of different countries in it, and lots of different countries today.
Exactly. So with that, let's pause for the lightning round sound effect at the beginning, and we will run through our 7 topics. Here we go. Number 1, Iran, JCPOA 2.0. We have not talked about this in now quite some time. With good reason. There hasn't been much going on, but just in the last week or so, there has been some news I think that's worthy to check in on, which is namely that there, since President Raisi was sworn into office in Iran in August, there was a lot of speculation as to what's going to happen next. Will the talks resume, the indirect talks in Vienna? And there is also this brewing standoff that had happened in terms of the IAEA team being able to effectively monitor the nuclear sites in Iran. Well, just about a week ago now, that impasse, at least for the moment, seems to have been sort of resolved, which is Iran indicated they would allow the IAEA monitoring team to be able to get access to update some of the monitoring equipment and footage and the sort of recordings that are being made at the sites and the like, and that's all kind of in process now. And that was prompted in part by threat of a censure among IAEA at the IAEA meeting that just took place last week, which could have had some additional consequences at the UN and perhaps beyond. The U.S., not surprisingly, has maintained sort of I think a pretty steady line here that they anticipate talks resuming, that they're waiting for Iran to essentially come back to the table. There's a UN General Assembly meeting in New York this week. There was some expectation that perhaps there could be some talks on the sidelines of that. The U.S. has kind of poo-pooed that to some degree, so unclear whether anything is going to be discussed even on the sidelines of that indirectly this week. But that's pretty much where we are, which is I think everybody is now, we're kind of positioned back in place for more talks to happen soon, which both sides and all of the P5+1 countries seem to indicate is the expectation that will happen probably sometime in October, but that's kind of where we are. So I'll throw it to Tim for any quick thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, not a lot is happening. I do think, it's interesting to note how far we've come from March and April when we had leaks from, a bunch of the parties in the room suggesting that a resumed deal was imminent. Now the good news is that the deal is not dead yet, because if the U.S. had lodged a grievance with the IAEA and Iran had basically refused to comply with any sort of monitoring, I think the deal would have been dead. So it was on the brink. It didn't die yet, but we do seem pretty far away from a renewed deal since talks aren't even going on at this point.
Yeah, sort of two final quick points. One is I saw somewhere that someone pointed out, like, look, with Raisi coming in and he's got a whole new team that he's putting in place to be part of the talks, not surprisingly, if he had wanted to kill the deal, he could have done it right now, right? So the fact that he did not do that, I think, signals that Iran does still want a deal. The U.S. clearly still wants a deal. I think everybody involved in the P5+1 wants a deal. How we get there continues to be the sticking point, and I think that still remains a little TBD how we're going to get there. And so, I think that's where we are. I will say that I have certainly heard rumblings, and you may have too, from others kind of out in the wild in Europe and other places that they are certainly watching this closely. And I think there's a feeling perhaps that there's some pre-planning going on of like 6 months from now, perhaps we could get back into Iran, and there might be, some things that could be explored and done in the future. I think there's still that optimism, cautious optimism out there for people who want this to happen and want to see things open back up, and assuming the sanctions relief comes through. So, I'll just add that certainly hasn't seemed to gone away at the moment.
The fundamental dynamic hasn't really changed in the sense that the Iranians want back into the deal, all other things being equal, and the U.S. wants back into the deal, all other things being equal. But that's been the dynamic for 8 months now, and they actually don't seem to be that close to a deal. And I do think the longer it takes, the less likely a deal is. So I think the clock is ticking, but I agree with you. If Raisi wanted out, he had an easy opportunity to get out at this point, and he didn't do it. So it's still alive.
Yeah. So with that, we'll leave Iran for now. Obviously, we'll be coming back to this soon, but let's move on to Afghanistan, and I will send that to Tim.
So Afghanistan, we spent a long time on the last podcast talking about Afghanistan, and what the sticky problem there is that the Taliban is a specially designated global terrorist, and when the government is run by an already designated terrorist group, it creates lots of issues with respect to trade in a particular country because the government has its fingerprints on all sorts of different transactions, and as a result, anybody who's trying to do business in the country has to figure out how can I get humanitarian aid into the country, for example, without providing support or basically dealing with the terrorist designated government. Um, as we talked about in the last segment, the dynamic isn't likely to change because the idea that the U.S. is going to essentially undesignate the Taliban is just doesn't seem very realistic. If anything,
I
it
think
seems
that's been
more
put to I think that's been put to bed at this point. I think it's been
right.
pretty clear that's not going to happen. Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's lots of reasons it won't happen, but I think politically, from what I'm reading in the last few weeks, it just seems like it's a non-starter, and I don't think the administration was going there. I think that also became apparent really during the pullout when the State Department went to OFAC and asked for a license that allowed it to undertake transactions that would have otherwise been prohibited by the SDGT regulations, and basically it wanted to deal with the Taliban as it needed to in order to get humanitarian trade into the country, and OFAC granted the license the next day. So at least for the next 6 months, from the U.S. government's perspective, it shouldn't have any real obstacles to getting humanitarian assistance into the country. But that seems like a very temporary kind of makeshift solution. And I don't know what's next, but I suspect that there will be some GLs dealing with humanitarian assistance so that it's not just the State Department that's able to do that.
Right. The license that Tim's referring to is kind of interesting, and my understanding is that, and the way we've learned about this is that this is being sort of shared with and given to parties who are acting sort of in concert with or under the direction of or under the umbrella of the State Department humanitarian efforts, whether it's NGOs or the like. So there is some coverage, at least for the moment, in terms of these humanitarian aid organizations, I would expect at some point there will be a full Iran Afghanistan program and some GLs, as Tim said. I think then that leaves kind of the big picture question that we raised the last time, which is, well, what's the approach going to be kind of long term here? I think it's clear that Taliban is going to remain designated, and I think the U.S. is taking a little bit of a wait and see approach in terms of whether they need to ratchet that up or do some additional targeted sanctions focused on the regime or certain actors within the regime, depending on how they behave here in these early stages. And all of the rhetoric that's coming out and all of the statements that are coming out is, look, if they want to be treated as a ruling governmental organization, they sort of have to act as such. And
Right.
if they act like a terrorist organization, then that's how we're going to treat them. If they act like a government, then perhaps we'll rethink things a little bit. So I think the big picture, what are we going to do? What's the U.S. sanctions kind of puzzle going to look like with respect to Afghanistan is not even close to being resolved yet. I think it is. I think what's clear is it seems that this is what we have for now, this license that Tim referenced, and then Taliban not coming, not gonna, its designation not going away, and then a little bit of a wait and see.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing, the final point that I would add to that is the big consequence of being on the SDGT list for the Taliban, and now that they're the government, is that they're going to have a very hard time accessing funds and making international banking transactions. And for a government, that's a big problem, especially a government here where, if you believe the reports, and I tend to believe them, the government is on the brink of collapse in the sense that they have no infrastructure. They've been war torn for 20 years, and a lot of the reports suggested that a lot of the money that might have been sent to them for that purpose was intercepted by the previous government. And so you've got this kind of government that is teetering and has no access to funds, and that seems to be U.S. strategy here. So it's not an unintended consequence, but it isn't a situation that can last in the long term, because there don't seem to be a lot of alternatives to the Taliban as the government in Afghanistan.
Right, right. So yeah, sustainability is not on the side of the current strategy, it seems. So we will
Right.
have to. That's why I think the wait and see is pretty open-ended and could take us in any number of different directions, kind of long term here. So we'll have to keep a close eye on that. But for now, that's sort of where we are with Afghanistan. So zipping right along and moving to topic number three, this is one now. This is a little bit of a looking back to something that came up while we were on vacation in August. So back on August 20 was the 1 year anniversary of the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. And so on that date, and this has become a favored tactic of the new administration, is to sort of roll out, and the next one of the Belarus is going to be the same thing. The next on the 1 year anniversary, there's sort of a sanctions package that gets announced to denounce the behavior, the malign activity that was the root cause of this, and it's sort of a clever kind of marketing strategy, if you will, when it comes to packaging up some of these things. So on that date, there was a number of different sanctions that were announced, relating some under the Chemical Biological Weapons Act, and some under kind of related authorities by both Treasury and state. And then on the same day, there was actually, back to one of our favorite topics, there was a new executive order that was issued relating to Nord Stream 2, which we announced was essentially done and dead and buried in terms of the U.S. action on that front, but not the case, because there is a new executive order that was signed on August 20th by President Biden, 14039, which is not a drastic change from what was in place before. It sort of did away with the imports exception, and allows for sort of full blocking sanctions to be imposed under PISA with relation to the actors that are involved in the pipeline development. And so that is now in fact the case, that there's a few different entities and vessels that are now fully blocked as a result of this. There is a general license in place to cover a lot of activities with those entities, but if they are sort of specifically listed on the SDN list, then they're basically carved out of that. So I guess just any quick thoughts that you have on either of those actions, just again, sort of Nord Stream 2 is just the issue that's never going to die, it seems, even though we're sort of still using the ally-friendly rhetoric in pushing these things out, and then anything more broadly on Navalny or any of the other activities there.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about it with Belarus too, but I think that these actions are largely symbolic at this point, because they don't really add anything new. but they are designed to kind of coincide with an anniversary, and it makes for a nice press release. But I'm not sure that it's a big change in sanctions law. I mean, there's a few more people on the SDN list or entities on the SDN list as a result, but not much has changed. At least that's my sense.
Yeah, some of the CBW Act related things now in terms of imports exports from Russia, I think sort of tighten the clamps a little bit, but that's kind of the general trend we've seen across the board. So this is sort of more of the same in that regard. In my view, I don't know that it's a drastic change, but yeah, I agree with you. I think this is sort of a useful tactic to continue to beat the drum on the sort of Russia malign activities and have this kind of front and center on a fairly regular basis with this administration. So yeah, not too much more to add there. And so with that, yeah, let's pivot to again the sort of kind of a kind of related topic, a sister topic, which is Belarus and what we saw come out
Right, right,
in August as well.
right around the same time is August 9th. Executive Order 14038 was signed by President Biden. It relates to Belarus. It was intentionally timed to coincide with what the administration described as his essentially having stolen the presidency after having lost the election. He claimed widespread fraud and was actually successful in keeping his position, mostly because the military supported his take over the country. And so, to coincide with the 1 year anniversary of that, the administration issued an executive order essentially expanding OFAC's authority to impose more sanctions against Belarus. Now, you want to be careful about this because they really haven't done this yet, but it does make the entire government of Belarus potentially subject to sanctions, including all agencies of the government. So the reach is broad, and then it also had a number of economic sectors that were also basically put under theoretical sanctions. So you've got the defense sector, the energy sector, the potash sector, the tobacco sector, the construction sector. They're made a number of designations that day as well, and they, with respect to these sectors, they often described those sectors as, this portion of Lukashenko's wallet, I think is OFAC's term. Essentially, these were sectors that OFAC had decided and entities that they designated that OFAC decided had been not only supporting Lukashenko, politically, but also financially. And so the purpose of these designations, the stated purpose, was to essentially try and cut off Lukashenko's access to resources. They also sanctioned, one legislator who supported him after he apparently ordered the seizure and kidnapping of an airplane that was flying over Belarus back in May, and some of the individuals who participated in that operation were also put under sanctions. So it was significant, but I do still see kind of a hesitation to go after Belarus more strongly, in part because it's in the heart of Europe. There's more connections between Belarus and some of the friendly countries there. I think we're also deferring some to the EU on this because this was essentially an attack on an EU flight, EU country to EU country, and so I think we're letting the EU take a lead. But from a symbolic perspective, it was interesting to do this a year later. From a what is the short term effect going to be? I'd say it's not going to be huge. I've gotten a few calls about it already from some of the sectors that had connections to the U.S., which obviously created big problems for those companies. But as a practical matter, I think this is one that sets the stage for really ramping up sanctions if the Belarusian government continues to misbehave. But in the short term, I think this is probably all that's going to happen in the short term.
Right. I would just add sort of two additional comments along the same lines. One is, as Tim said, given the breadth of the executive order, which now makes many of these key industries in Belarus key to the regime and key just to their economy more broadly, it just makes it that much more complicated to sort of continue to do business without incurring lots of risk in that jurisdiction. And I think it's that those are the types of calls that I think we're getting, which are people looking ahead. They're not necessarily dealing with parties that are sanctioned right now, but now they're fearful that they could be dealing with parties or have business or have connections or partnerships in sectors that are going to be susceptible to sanctions in the future under this executive order. And so what do we do? Do we pull up stakes now? Do we sort of have an escape plan if things get worse? What do we do? So I think those are sort of the risk judgments that a lot of companies are looking at right now, especially companies that are based in Europe that have just more connections there generally, I think. And then the second thing is it strikes me that this approach is very similar to what we've seen with Burma.
Yep.
And so it's sort of the same kind of approach. It's, the executive order, it's kind of the wallet. You sort of canvassing the wallet of the regime, the disfavored regime, to try to put in place all the authorities you need to go after their sources of revenue and potentially target those in a strategic way to dry up their resources. But you're trying not to put the clamps down and impose something that is going to be more drastic and could then have secondary, tertiary consequences that you just don't want to trigger. And so I think that this, to me, seems like a very similar approach there. It gives the U.S. and gives OFAC more flexibility to expand in the future in a more targeted way. But right now, it is they're trying to be a bit surgical into how they go about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sets the stage. It also just dries up foreign investment. I mean, people who see these orders and particularly how broad these sectors are not going to make a decision right now to go into those sectors. They may not pull out immediately, but they're certainly those sectors are likely not to expand in Belarus anytime soon. Now that they're kind of the potential target of sanctions, somebody wants to get into those sectors knowing that one stroke of a pen and that your supplier is an SDN.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, and so with that, we are flying along. We're on to topic number 5, and this is a favorite of ours, but one we haven't talked about in a while, which is CFIUS in China. So there was a transaction in particular that was in the news or in the spotlight to some degree, just in the past few weeks, relating to a transaction focused on the semiconductor industry, which, as we know, is a hot button topic when it comes to China, whether it be with respect to foreign investment or export controls, or the like. And so this is the Magna Chip Semiconductor Corporation. This is a deal, and for the background here, very quickly, for those who don't know about this, back in the early part of this year, there was a deal announced, and Magna Chip is actually based in South Korea, but incorporated in Delaware through various, its structures. And there was a Chinese PE firm that was investing in this South Korean entity, and CFIUS got wind of this. It was not notified to the committee, but because they are listed in the U.S. and they are incorporated in the U.S., there was a notice that was sent by the non-notified team at CFIUS to say we think we need to see a filing on this transaction because it comes within our jurisdiction. And they went through the process, and apparently by late August, there was a letter that was sent that said, we believe there's unresolved national security issues that can't be mitigated, and we're prepared to refer this matter to the president for prohibition, for blocking. And what has now happened, it seems, based on the 8K filing with the SEC that Magna Chip made just a few days ago, they apparently requested of CFIUS the ability to do what's known as a withdrawal and refile, which we've talked about before, which is typically something you do when you kind of run out of time in the CFIUS process and you say, look, we want to take one more go at trying to come up with some solution that might be palatable to the committee that would prevent this from being recommended for a block to the president. And so that's where they are now. They are back on the clock, I think, as of just a couple of days ago. So they have until sort of late October to get through the initial 45-day period, and then that could potentially roll over for another 45 for an investigation. But that's where they are. Is that there was all signals were that this was a deal that was about to get blocked, and they're now in sort of version 2.0 of trying to get this reviewed by CFIUS and perhaps come up with some kind of a mitigation plan that would be palatable, and address the unresolved national security concerns. So the two things I'll note, um, let me note three things really quickly. So um, again, this was not notified to the committee, which perhaps is not that surprising given that it's a Chinese firm that was looking at a Korean company, but because of the connections to the U.S., CFIUS took the view and after having learned about it, that it was within their jurisdiction and asked for filing. So that's notable because of the scope of the breadth of the jurisdiction. Something to bear in mind for anybody out there that thinks that they might be entirely clear of CFIUS jurisdiction. Make you better be pretty sure of that if you're going to proceed, because these guys were pretty far along and then got the tap on the shoulder that said, we think we actually want to take a look at this one. Number two is, again, it was not notified. So breadth of jurisdiction with not notifying. Those are sort of two, I think, increasing trends, post FIRMA that we've been seeing, that this is kind of bearing out now and playing out now in a very kind of public way here. And then the third thing is semiconductors. You cannot stress enough what a priority this is and continues to be and has been now for the U.S. government for such a long time in terms of any U.S. Semiconductor, whether it's technology, expertise, IP, trade secrets, financing, anything, they're going to try to get their hands on if it's going to flow back to China. And so I think that's what we're seeing here, is sort of all those things kind of playing out. And so it's kind of an interesting one. We haven't had one of these bubble up in a while. It's the first one, to my knowledge, that's sort of bubbled up to have been positioned for a referral to the president in a block, at least under the current administration, first one in a little while. And so, largely at the end of the day, this is not anything different than what we saw under the prior administration, and it's not really that different than what we saw toward the end of the Obama administration in terms of the way this has played out. I think, if anything, broader reach, more aggressive, and kind of a ruthless efficiency with sort of identifying this, saying nope, this is not going to be able to happen, and now this is where they are. So that's what I have on that one.
Yeah, I mean, this was a pretty aggressive action, and I think that's what jumps out the most to me from this is that you have CFIUS post FIRMA with an affirmative, essentially law enforcement unit that is now trying to find deals that might be subject to its jurisdiction and reviewing those deals in a way that prior to FIRMA, I mean, we just didn't see and wouldn't expect. I mean,
They
I
always
think
did it. They always did it, but it was more ad
sure.
hoc, and they have far more resources
Yeah,
dedicated to it.
yeah. No,
Far
I
more.
mean, they always did it, but
Yeah.
you pre FIRMA and pre the building of this unit, the assumption was basically it could come to their attention, and if it did kind of randomly come to their attention, then they certainly have always had the power to reach out like this, but they just weren't doing it on such a regular basis. It was just random as to the transactions they'd find. This doesn't seem random at all. This seems like they're watching this industry in particular very, very closely and are getting staffed up enough so that they can go after transactions like this when they want to and need to. I mean, the second thing that I'll throw out there is it's also just another good example of how aggressive they're being on China. And this is not, it might relate to Huawei. I mean, I think there's a lot left behind the scenes that we don't know about, in the sense that the semiconductor charge has been led by the actions that the Commerce Department in particular has taken against Huawei with respect to Huawei's entity list status, and basically, refining what that entity list status meant, particularly with regard to semiconductors. But it does seem like if you're in kind of the sweet spot where you've got a China connection and a semiconductor connection, CFIUS is looking, and it's unlikely that you're going to be able to get investment deals done that involve that particular combination of factors without attracting some attention, which suggests that if you're going to go down that road, you probably just ought to show up in CFIUS. Which brings me to the third thought here, and I'm going to throw it back to you on this. I mean, if I were looking at how to mitigate this transaction, I'm not sure where I'd begin, because I guess the only thought that I would have is that you'd need to do it in a way where the investment is purely passive and the Chinese investors are not going to be able to get their hands on the semiconductor technology in any meaningful way and not be able to use the semiconductor technology to supply Chinese companies like Huawei. But at the end of the day, I don't know how you would make that happen in a way that's enforceable. So I'm not sure where I'd go on the mitigation
Yeah,
piece on this.
I think that's particularly difficult because my understanding is that the company, that Magna Chip, does not have operations in the U.S. So this is not the kind of thing that is really susceptible to the typical monitoring protocols and oversight protocols that CFIUS would normally want to put in place for a deal like this. If it even in a country like Korea, which is a close U.S. ally, there's just that distance. I think makes it impractical, if not impossible, to get the level of comfort that you could have. Perhaps if this was a company that was sitting in Silicon Valley or Austin or Boston or some other tech hotbed in the US, it might maybe incrementally increase the possibility you could find some solution. But here, I agree. I'm not quite sure how you do that or how they could ever get comfortable with that. And so, we'll see if perhaps they come up with a solution in the next couple months. But yeah, I agree. I think it's a pretty pretty tall task and a pretty uphill battle to see how they could come up with something that would work here.
All right.
All right, with that, let's leave CFIUS behind for the moment. We have two topics to go. We are flying through, um,
Flying
and
through.
and so by our standards, we are definitely flying through. And so with that, let me turn to Tim to talk briefly about a recent OFAC settlement.
All right. Well, we're going to talk about a settlement that took place on August 27th. And it was a settlement between a bank, so First Bank SA and OFAC. First Bank SA is located in Romania, and it essentially admitted to having processed U.S. dollar payments for a bunch of sanctioned countries. So essentially, it was processing U.S. dollar payments for entities located in Iran. It was processing U.S. dollar payments for entities located in Syria, and it was also processing euro-denominated payments to Iran as a foreign sub of a U.S. company. And so that last one is something that I wanted to think a little bit harder about, because at least in 2018, First Bank was a Romanian bank. Non-U.S. dollar payments could be processed by a Romanian bank. Potentially there were some secondary sanctions issues, but if it's euro payments and it's a Romanian bank and there's no U.S. nexus to the transaction, then these potentially were not sanctionable transactions. But in 2018, First Bank, a Romanian bank, was bought by a U.S. company, and so it was bought by J.C. Flowers. And after J.C. Flowers took over, J.C. Flowers, I believe, did a review post closing and determined that there were at least some potential sanctions issues. Did a voluntary disclosure and then did a 5-year look back and found these violations that I was just talking about. As it turned out, that was good for J.C. Flowers because essentially, once it found these and disclosed them, and there were a decent number of them, I think it was about $1.7 million worth of transactions, they all came under the umbrella of the voluntary disclosure, and it was able to take what could have been a pretty high penalty given the number of transactions and the amount, and came to a settlement of 862,318, which is pretty good considering how long the violations took place and what was happening in connection with them. And I think it's an example of a situation where when you're weighing should I go do a voluntary disclosure, it's a good example of how you can get pretty significant leniency from a voluntary disclosure. I think what it illustrates, and this is how I think we would have read it anyway, but OFAC always gives the little helpful lessons at the end. One is that, as a Romanian bank, it appears that First Bank was not particularly conversant in U.S. sanctions and what sort of U.S. nexus could potentially result in a U.S. sanctions violation. So it was doing dollar transactions without seeming to realize that was a sufficient U.S. nexus, which is a problem. I mean, even before the U.S. takeover, and then after the U.S. Takeover, it became subject to the provision of the Iran regs that deals with U.S. owned or controlled companies. And so, it's a good example of, both when you are a U.S. investor, how minimal the OFAC knowledge might be, even within foreign banks. And which is why when you do a transaction like this as a U.S. company, you've got to come in, do your due diligence, do your post-closing due diligence, and really try and make sure that you get the house in order, because this, obviously nobody wants to get, close to $900,000 penalty, but this could have been a lot worse if they had handled this differently and had come to OFAC's attention another way. So it's, an example of why voluntary disclosures are sometimes helpful to companies, and why, as a U.S. investor, if you buy a foreign company, you really do need to do your risk assessment and do your look at potential OFAC compliance. And when you find bad stuff, make an informed decision about whether to disclose.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. I would just add a couple of quick points. One is, to me, it's that last piece. It's the euro-denominated transactions that occurred entirely outside the U.S. financial system, but occurred after the U.S. parent had bought the Romanian bank.
Yep.
And then, as Tim said, that then puts you under um, 215, and you're going to be covered by the foreign entities owned or controlled by U.S. persons provisions. These are the provisions, of course, that during the time the U.S. was part of the JCPOA, that General License H was intended to sort of allow a bit of a carve out here, where as long as no U.S. persons involved, you can the non-U.S. aspects of these types of entities were allowed to do some of these types of things depending on the circumstances. But here, not the case any longer, obviously. And I think that's one where people get tripped up on that a lot. And I would also add, in the same vein, I think people also say, and this it seems was just a bit of a disconnect when the U.S. parent came in. They ascribe, well, if we just do the transaction in euros, then we'll be fine. We don't have to worry about we don't have to worry about OFAC, which is just not the case. It is just
Right.
not the case for a variety of reasons. This being one of them is obviously is here
Right.
with the U.S. parent, then that's you put you in very different footing. But even if it was not a U.S. parent, and euros were involved, then who then you still have to worry about sort of the banks you're dealing with and many other aspects of it in terms
It
of
could be U.S.
right,
goods. You could have a U.S. person that's in the chain in some
that are
other way
providing services.
facilitating. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. So it just I think that the I just wanted to flag that one thing because I've heard so many times when people say, well, as long as we do it in euros, it won't be a problem, and that's not necessarily the case. And so anybody who thinks that that is shorthand for it is U.S. sanctions compliant as long as we do it in euros, that is under the ITSR, that is just don't use that as a fail-safe because you need to think through the other consequences of the structure, who's involved, and how it's all going to work to really understand whether or not it is in fact compliant.
You can see how this happened. I hadn't really focused on it until you were talking about this last kind of tranche of euro payments, but the timing also would have
It's
created
right after
great
the
confusion. I mean,
reimposition,
it's
right?
it's as General License H was going
Going
away,
away. Yep.
and not only that, I mean, these transactions are pretty soon after the takeover. I mean, it's been my experience. I mean, it's not um, best practices, obviously, but when a company does its due diligence, does the takeover, um, it takes a little while to actually come in and do all of the post-closing, due diligence and/or, the remediation measures that you need to take. And so here, these transactions were only a few months after the close, and while General License H is essentially going away, but creating confusion along the way. And so I can see how it happened, although
Right.
it is a real problem because they certainly weren't. I think they were doing exactly what you said, Brian, which was, well, these are euros, so we don't have to worry about it.
Right. It may very well have been the case. And so, in any event, I think just a few interesting little tidbits from that one that maybe you don't see in every OFAC settlement. So we just wanted to call those out, bring them to attention quickly, because they are pretty common. These are common issues that we see that come up time and again, sort of across the board, not just in the financial sector, but in other sectors that have these types of issues come up. And so that brings us now to the final topic of the day, final topic of the episode, which is Ethiopia and the new executive order that was just issued on Friday and the new program that has now been stood up to address humanitarian and human rights related concerns in Ethiopia. And so, this is uh, the executive order that's in place here, and I should say we've gotten already a number of questions, as I'm sure many others have as well, because you see a new program, you see a new executive order. I think immediately people say, well, wait a minute, does that mean I have to stop doing business in Ethiopia? Does that mean that, how broad does the sweep? I mean, to be clear, I think this is It's a menu-based sanctions program. This is not, which includes potentially blocking sanctions that can be imposed on the folks that are identified here and determined to be, among the categories of sanctionable persons under the program. But it is not at the moment sort of a broad or sweeping program that I would expect to sort of um, you know se- severely hinder the ability, in particular, of humanitarian aid and goods to continue to flow to Ethiopia. In fact, it's designed to sort of do the opposite of that, I think, and to hopefully help that occur more seamlessly and perhaps again in a very targeted way. This is sort of a theme that we've already hit on a couple times today. Go after sort of the true bad actors in the view of OFAC and the U.S. government, and put them sort of target them for certain menu-based sanctions, and then hopefully allow for the unencumbered flow of humanitarian aid and goods to continue to go to the country. So that's sort of in a nutshell what you're dealing with here um, with the new Ethiopia executive order. So I'll throw it to Tim for some quick thoughts on
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I don't have much to add to that. I mean, it's basically, the questions that I'm seeing so far are, is Ethiopia under sanctions? I've got some business opportunities there. Can I not do business in Ethiopia? And the answer is no. Ethiopia this was not designed to keep business out of Ethiopia. This was a very limited sanctions program that is unlikely to expand in a way that some of these other ones would. So the Belarus sanctions, they really are going after the Belarus government. It is designed to put pressure on the leadership of Belarus. This was much more, I think, intended to be much more targeted at the conflict in northern Ethiopia and really trying to prevent human rights violations, trying to, help to prevent, seizures or essentially theft of some of the humanitarian aid that was going into that region. And so the whole point was to actually help trade, a certain kind of trade, at least in Ethiopia, not to essentially put pressure on companies to get out of the company or country altogether. But I fear, that the way that these sanctions programs tend to work is that banks are going to start looking at Ethiopia as a higher risk country now, and it may make it harder to actually send the sort of transactions into Ethiopia than it was before the sanctions order came out. But we'll see. But just the reaction of some of the questions that I'm getting makes me worried that this is going to be viewed much more broad, as being much more broad than it actually is, and much less targeted.
Yeah, to that point, I would just encourage anybody who's interested or this to whom this may be relevant to take a look at the FAQs that were issued contemporaneously with the release of the executive order, because OFAC makes very clear, for example, that the 50% rule is not going to apply here.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I think that's always that's given that these are menu-based sanctions, they are meant to be very specifically targeted, and they're not meant to sort of cast a wide net as they are in other programs, and for exactly the reasons that Tim just said. And so, our hope would be that people are going to actually read and understand the scope of these and not sort of read too much into them or read them in sort of an unnuanced
Right.
way to presume too much about what this now prohibits or limits or could prohibit or limit in the future. So yeah, I agree with everything Tim said, but obviously as time goes on, I think we'll see and get a sense of how these are being implemented and interpreted. I would presume that we'll probably see more. There were a few general licenses issued right away, and I
Yep.
presume we'll see more of that. And as designations are rolled out in the future, we'll sort of see how those are targeted and whether they sort of stay in line with what we're expecting.
Yeah, I mean, I wish there were an easy way to put it, in the sense that Ethiopia is really not under sanctions. There are some sanctions that apply in Ethiopia to
Right.
a targeted group of people, and that is really the difference between this and, say, an Iran type program, and or even a Burma or Belarus type program. But I worry about overcompliance with respect to these, and that they might make the situation worse.
Right. Given that this is brand new, barely 48 hours old, we will keep our eyes on how this is going to play out, and again how it's implemented and enforced going forward. But for the time being, that's what we're expecting with the new program in Ethiopia. So with that, I think we are wrapped up, and that is a record for us. That is a record.
Seven topics.
That's truly a lightning round by our standards. That's 7 topics in not even 45 minutes. So I think on the next episode, so thank you for joining. On the next episode, we're possibly, if not likely, going to have some guests on to talk about perhaps a more sort of targeted subtopic that we also don't get to talk about enough on the show, perhaps more going forward. But we're still working on that. But I think in a couple weeks we will be back in early October with our new episode, probably a guest or two that are going to join to discuss that with us, and so we're looking forward to that. But unless there's a breakthrough in the Iran the Iran talks
Right.
or something truly monumental happens in the next 2 weeks, which there could be another coup as we speak right now, the way things are going. So in 2021, so who knows? But that's our
Or
plan
another
for now.
or another no hitter. I think they're about equally common in 2021.
I think there's more no hitters than coups, thankfully, if any
Yes.
baseball fans out there, but not by many, not by many.
Yep.
So yeah. So with that, thank you all for joining us for this all lightning round edition of Embargoed. We appreciate you stopping by, and until next time, I hope everybody stays well and stays sanctions free.
Stay sanctions free, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.